Hey, this is Mr. Hargesheimer, and this is your April the 10th social studies class. I am putting this on YouTube in case anyone needs to go back and see directions or overviews of things. This will be the same content that was in our online session. So if you're ready, here we go. Your week one assignments were supporting questions number one and number two, and I'm going to go over those. And your week two assignments are going to be a brief summative task, which will be an argument based on the compelling question, an extension activity, and a taking informed action uh, where you'll be writing a proposal. So if we were in class, this is the point where you would have your microphone muted and you would have typed into the chat for attendance. If you're watching this on YouTube, please put a comment at the bottom so that I know who has been online watching it and that you have seen the video. So our etiquette for our online classes, which I will be going over in class every time we meet. You should be prepared, which means whatever device you bring should be charged. If you are capable of having a distraction free workspace in your home, please go to that space and be prepared to work from there. If you need supplies, whether you need to have a charger ready, if you're supposed to have pencil and paper for a class, something like that, have those things ready, please. Respectful during that time means that your microphone is muted so that there are no distractions during instruction. We will have time at the end for you all to converse and catch up. I'll probably set aside maybe 10, 15 minutes for that. Use the chat for any questions you have. And also, please sign into the chat so that I know who is in attendance. And even though you're at home, people can see you through the camera. So please dress appropriately. To stay on task, keep all your other tabs closed. Don't log in and then look for YouTube videos the whole time or play an online game or things like that. Try to stay engaged with people. This is one of your few chances to see everybody, to catch up, to have an opportunity to ask questions, those sorts of things. Um, when you do have questions, please ask them in the chat only. If you come up with a question later, maybe you watch the YouTube version of this, feel free to email me. I'm going to try to set up times online where I'll just have a Google Meet open. But again, I've been having trouble with my Chromebook and doing that and not getting kicked out or having it crash or freeze. So we'll see how that goes. And also, a way to stay disciplined during this time when you don't really have much of a set schedule is try to create your own schedule. Have a routine of times where you do your work. Maybe you get up in the morning before class, get work done, and then when you have your classes between 11 and 2, um, you're checking in with teachers to ask questions. The important part is staying engaged and checking in often. So, some general NTI information for you. I will do my best to be available by email as much as possible, but I will definitely be there between the hours of 11 and 2:30 Monday through Friday. After finding out some of your all's habits, that's 11:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. So don't be up in the middle of the night trying to log in and find what I'm doing. I will be hopefully sound asleep during those hours. Any of the due dates I give you, they're going to be for Fridays just to mark the end of a week. If you're late, don't worry about that. If it's things come up at home and it's 2 weeks down the road before you get to something, I will go back and fill in your attendance for that week's worth of work you did. And I will also not take off anything for assignments that are late. The important part is the priority is that you're going to stay engaged with school and that you're getting some work done because we're still working on the premise that you're all going to high school and it's going to open in the fall, and we want you as much as possible to be prepared. I prefer to have class meetings. I want to have some video overviews on YouTube so that you can get through the PowerPoint of the content in maybe an uninterrupted manner. If this technology becomes too much of a problem for me, I will probably have classes pre-recorded for YouTube videos only. That's not my preference, but it was very frustrating to be kicked out, and I don't want to make a habit of that. So the title of the IDM that we're working on right now is called Priorities in the New Nation. Our compelling question is, what should be the limits on the powers of the federal government? So we're going to look at the federal government in terms of crises that come up during the time we're looking at. It's going to be war, and it's going to be arguing about what rights states have as far as the ability to secede or leave the country, or whether or not they should be able to work outside of the federal government, or how much control should the federal government have over the states. So the federal government is going to be not only dealing with state governments, but also dealing with other countries. And I'm going to include their interactions with Native Americans as another country, even though the tribes were separate and the nations were separate in that way. And I'm going to try to connect that to things that are currently going on, specifically the coronavirus, the pandemic that we're all suffering through right now. So the standards and the tasks that we're going to be doing, I'm going to be asking you to generate supporting questions. We're going to examine the role of Kentucky and Kentuckians, and we're also going to evaluate or make judgments on how individuals and groups addressed these local, regional, and global problems. We're going to be looking at regional and global problems in this one. We're going to focus on those. So week one, you should have already had a look at supporting questions number 1 and number 2. For week 2, you will have a very brief summative task, extension, and taking informed action, which is going to be in the form of a very brief proposal. So the sources that we're going to be looking at for supporting question number 1, what is the relationship between federal and state governments? You're going to be looking at South Carolina, what's called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, written by John C. Calhoun, which argues that South Carolina, if they don't like something the federal government's done, that they shouldn't have to follow it. We're going to look again, because we've looked at some of this in the past, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. We'll be looking specifically at the Kentucky ones written by Thomas Jefferson. There was something called the Hartford Convention, which was a group of New England states that talked about leaving the United States, and what amendments to the Constitution did they propose. And we're going to look at something called the American System that was created by a Kentuckian named Henry Clay. And it has to do with raising money for jobs and to improve industry and businesses here in the United States. And we're also going to look at powers the federal government has to deal with other nations. We'll look at Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural address when he talks about the purpose of government. We will look at this issue of what's called impressment, and that is when sailors and goods are captured at sea and forced to work on other ships. And this is going to lead to the War of 1812. So we'll look at the declaration of war against Great Britain, which is War of 1812. We will look at the Monroe Doctrine, which is the idea that Europeans should not be in the Western Hemisphere. And we will also look at Jefferson's speech to a delegation of Indian chiefs from 1806, just to get an idea of the American government's attitude towards these nations. So, your week 1 assignments for the priorities in the new nation. Your first question was, what is the relationship between federal and state governments? And you had a chart that I didn't get any questions about, so I'm feeling like you guys are comfortable with that. I got a couple of questions about this second one. What powers does the federal government have in dealing with other nations? So I'm going to give you an example of what it is I'm looking for when I say a summary in that sense. So you were to have read each primary source, each one of the 4 sources for each question, 8 total. For the first one, you completed a chart. For the second one, you were going to summarize or write out in sentence form. And the documents I gave you, you should be able to edit. I set them all up to where every student had their own copy, and I will try to do all assignments in that manner. And again, all the due dates are just for guidance for you. This should take you about a week to get through this, whatever I give you for that week. And again, they're flexible. If you do the whole thing next week, that's fine. If you do things the day I post them, if I put them up on a Sunday and then you do them all Sunday, you're done with your social studies for the week. An example, and this is for supporting question number 2, writing in paragraph form. This will have to do with the Monroe Doctrine. A summary of what the government's priority is during this dealing with European countries. In the Monroe Doctrine, President Monroe threatens European countries against involving themselves anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. That's my one-sentence summary of what Monroe is talking about in this excerpt. And by Western Hemisphere, I mean North America, Central America, South America. And a piece of evidence that supports that is from the source. It is impossible that the Allied powers should extend their political system to any any part of either continent without endangering our peace and happiness, or any portion. So this is excerpt backs up my summary of what the Monroe Doctrine is about. So some vocabulary you may need to get through these sources so that you understand them a little bit better. One is the idea of nullification. And this is, we talked about it with Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. It's coming back with John C. Calhoun's exposition. And it will also come about later in the Civil War if, fingers crossed, we ever get there. And it's the idea that state governments do not have to follow federal laws if they believe they're unconstitutional and that they can secede or leave the United States. Impressment, again, is forcing people, usually sailors, into service. The British Navy was impressing American sailors, attacking their ships, taking all their goods, and forcing the American sailors to be part of the British Navy. The War of 1812 went from June 1812 to February of 1815, and it was a war between the U.S. and Great Britain over this idea of impressment. And most of the fight took place here at sea and at the border between the U.S. and Canada, where the British controlled Canada at the time. The Hartford Convention, again, a group of New England states met secretly to talk about leaving the United States and forming their own alliance with Great Britain. They were under the fear that the war was going badly and the U.S. would lose. But before any of their findings became public, the war ended, so they kind of were looked at more of like traitors as opposed to being taken seriously. The American system, again, from Henry Clay, its policy of promoting the U.S. or industry in the U.S. through high tariffs, which a tariff is a tax on imports coming into the country, and internal improvements, which is anything that has to do with building up railroads, bridges, canals, roads, anything that builds up the United States. So they're taking money from things being sold from outside the United States and brought in. They're taking extra money or a tax on that and using that to build up roadways, canals, railroads, that sort of thing. And lastly, the Monroe Doctrine, which I mentioned in my example earlier, it just statement of U.S. foreign policy that opposed any European influence or control in the Western Hemisphere, again, North, Central, South America. So I have for you a very quick video, which is going to give you the objectives and the outcomes of the War of 1812. So it takes about 3 minutes.
Two centuries after it was fought, there are still doubts as to who won the War of 1812. Canadians have seen it as a war of defense in which American invaders were successfully repelled. As for the Americans, historians have often viewed it as a naval war. They were trying to defend themselves from the British Navy, which had been boarding their vessels and kidnapping their sailors. The War of 1812 was sometimes referred to as the Second War of Independence. But as the former enemies became allies in the 20th century, the War of 1812 was regarded as a family quarrel that was best forgotten. Today, the question remains, who won? According to some historians, it depends on what the objectives were. If Britain's main goal was to prevent the United States from conquering British territory in North America, then Britain, and by extension Canada, could be said to have won. But the American objective was less about taking over Canada and more about asserting its independence as a country. The war actually started because of a much larger conflict taking place in Europe. Britain was at war against Napoleon. The United States was neutral, however, Britain wanted to stop the Americans from trading with the French. Britain used its naval force to board American trading vessels, confiscate goods, and impress sailors into the Royal Navy. The Americans responded by declaring war and attacking Britain's Canadian territory. They didn't get far on land, but the Americans scored some morale-boosting victories on the water. As the war was ending, American defenders led by Andrew Jackson repelled a British invasion at New Orleans. That victory became a great source of pride for the Americans. Since there was no more fighting, it felt like they had won. In reality, neither country lost or gained any territory as a result of the war, so while there was no clear winner, there is no argument about who lost. Historians on all sides agree that the indigenous peoples of North America suffered huge losses as a result of the war. In the United States, they were forced to give up their lands and settle on reservations. In British Canada, the war led to disunity and conflict between First Nations. The British no longer needed Aboriginal warriors as allies, thus their power diminished. So more than 200 years after it was fought, we know who lost the War of 1812, but we're still not sure who won.
All right, again, that's a quick overview of the objectives of War of 1812 and some of the outcomes. This next part is going to be a brief explanation of Henry Clay's American system. It's going to be just a little bit shorter than the last one. Towards the end of this, they're going to be talking a little bit more about the Second National Bank, which is not quite as important as the idea of tariffs or taxes coming in and the building up of infrastructure, internal improvements, which is, think of transportation, railroads, canals, bridges, roads.
The American system, which developed from the 1810s through the 1830s, was a three-part economic plan to develop American industry, commerce, and agriculture. Kentucky Congressman Henry Clay designed the plan. His plan sought first to protect American industry by placing protective tariffs on imported goods. Second, the plan sought to spur the economy by establishing the second bank of the United States. Third, the plan called for federal monies to improve the country's transportation system, including roads, bridges, and canals, thereby giving farmers and manufacturers easier access to markets. Its supporters believed that the plan would allow the federal government to foster economic stability and growth. Backers of Clay's plan included members of the National Republican Party, who had opposed Andrew Jackson's 1824 Democratic-Republican presidential campaign. When Jackson won the presidency in 1828, however, the National Republicans formed the Whig Party to challenge Jackson's Democratic Republicans in the 1834 congressional elections. In time, Congress enacted portions of the American system. Protective tariffs proposed by the system, for example, taxed imported goods. Industrial and manufacturing regions supported the tariffs, while agricultural areas, particularly in the South, opposed them, raising questions about the power of the federal government versus states' rights. The plan also called for federal funding to improve infrastructure. This consisted of upgrading the country's roads, bridges, railroads, and canals. States' rights advocates opposed what they considered an unconstitutional exercise of power by the federal government. The 20-year charter of the controversial First Bank of the United States expired in 1811 when Jeffersonian Republicans blocked the effort to renew it. Yet, in 1816, the United States faced war debts and a slumping economy. And a range of leaders, including Henry Clay, financier John Jacob Astor, Treasury Secretary Alexander Dallas, and South Carolina Democrat-Republican John C. Calhoun, believed that a second bank could help manage the country's debts. After much contentious debate, a somewhat reluctant President James Madison signed a bill in April 1816 establishing a second Bank of the United States, whose charter would last for 20 years. The second bank became a campaign issue in the election of 1832. Running for re-election, Andrew Jackson called it the Monster Bank. Meanwhile, the bank's proponents asked Congress to renew the bank's charter in January of 1832, 4 years before it was due to expire. Later that year, legislation passed the House and the Senate to renew the charter, but Jackson vetoed the bill. He ran his re-election campaign in part on opposition to the bank and won re-election in the 1832 presidential election. To Jackson's joy, the bank's charter expired in 1836, giving him victory in what has been called the Bank War.
All right. So your week 2 assignments are going to have to do with these sources, and you having answers for these supporting questions. You are going to, for your summative task, argue for the compelling question, what should the extent of the powers of the federal government be? And again, this has to do in relation to the states and other nations in times of crises. So your claim should be based on power over states or against other nations during a time of war or the threat of war, something like that. That's what we're looking at during this time period, primarily. Evidence should come from at least 3 of the 8 sources, and it should be used to support your claim. And you should be able to explain how this evidence is connected to your claim. So your claim, your evidence, and your reason is going to be your answer to the question, evidence from the sources or examples from the sources, and what the connection is. You will also have an extension activity, which is 2 questions, and I can't emphasize enough, I don't want the answers to these questions. I want you only coming up with the questions. So you're going to write 2 supporting questions. A supporting question has a definite, factual, evidence-based answer. You can not disagree or agree with this. It's just pieces of factual information. So to argue about what should the powers of the governor of Kentucky today be in relation to this coronavirus, you are going to, what pieces of factual information would you need to have to be able to argue for or against or to describe the limits of the powers of the governor of Kentucky today? So again, only questions, no answers. So would you need to know something about the laws? In Kentucky, the laws of the federal government, laws in other states? What are laws between states or agreements? What 2 questions would you need answered before you could know what the limits of power of the governor of Kentucky should be? And the last part is a proposal, taking informed action, and this will be to the governor of Kentucky. What actions should he, Governor Beshear, take to keep Kentuckians safe from the coronavirus? What are the reasons why he should take these actions? So what should he do? Why should he do it? And what will the outcome be if he does? So what should the governor do? Why should he do it? And what is the end result or the outcome of taking these actions? What should it be? And lastly, have a fantastic weekend. Please practice social distancing like our friend Bigfoot, who is the champion of social distancing. I just want you guys to know on a personal level, I miss you all. It was very fun to come in and teach you guys, and I hope we have an opportunity before the year's out to get back together. Anyway, stay safe, wash your hands.